Hello, and welcome back to Taurus Software's video series on working with DataBridger and Salesforce. My name is Steve, and I'll be presenting this video for you. In this video, we're going to be introducing you to virtual tables. Virtual tables are the mechanism we use to interact with cloud-based data sources. As a frame of reference, when we work with relational databases in DataBridger, we're able to see the tables and views and their structures right inside DataBridger. We can then use DataBridger to perform actions like inserting or updating or deleting straight from or to that relational data source. When we work with cloud environments, however, we don't have direct access to the underlying data structures. And like most cloud-based environments, Salesforce is very object-oriented. As such, then, we work with objects like accounts and contacts, leads, and opportunities. And when we work with objects, we can perform actions against them. Things like creating or updating or retrieving or querying those objects. And when we work with cloud environments like Salesforce and other environments, we work through a set of APIs, programming services, that allow us to interact with these objects using SOAP requests. And SOAP is Simple Object or Access Protocol, a predefined language or structure for interacting with these kinds of environments. The actions that we're able to perform and the objects that we can perform these actions against are defined by a WSDL file, which stands for Web Service Definition Language. That was covered in an earlier tutorial, and that was what was used in order to make the connection to the Salesforce data source. So when we define a virtual table, what we are actually doing is specifying that we want to perform an action against an object by using the services that are defined within that WSDL file. We're going to create a simple virtual table in this exercise, and that virtual table is going to be used to load data into one of the objects in Salesforce. We're going to load some data from a comma delimited file that we've already got defined in our data sources in this particular exercise, and that data source is a spreadsheet saved as a CSV file. And if we look at the data, it's simple company name and address information with the company name, address, city, state, postal code, and the entity ID, or just the account number. So we're going to use these entries from this CSV file, and we're going to load those into Salesforce as accounts in our exercise. So to create a virtual table, we simply right-click on the data source, in this case the Salesforce data source, and we choose the option to add a virtual table. Now, as I had stated earlier, we're working based on information that's defined in the API through the WSDL file. And the objects and actions that are available in that file are listed here to start with. And you will see that we have SOAP service requests that we can perform, and they include things like creating or deleting or updating or querying or retrieving data from or writing to the data sources in Salesforce, the objects. When we choose one, in this case we're going to create entries, so we choose create, and you notice that we have the option to either specify this as something we're going to be using for reading or something we're going to be using for writing. In the case of creating data in Salesforce, we will specify that this is for writing. So we're going to create entries in an object. Once we've specified that we're going to be creating and it's a writing type of exercise, we click OK. Once we get there, we have our window that's our wizard for working through the exercise of specifying two different things with a virtual table. We have buttons here that allow us to see two aspects of the cloud-based environment: the data or the request that we send to the cloud, which is what I'm looking at here, and then this button next to it allows us to see the configuration of the response back from the cloud. So depending on what we are doing, creating, updating, querying, then the SOAP request will be determined by that action. In the case of writing data or creating data, we are going to simply expand this entry here that allows us to then say, oh, you're going to do some kind of action against an object. What object is it that you're working with? And you can see that we have a list of all of the different objects in Salesforce. And there are literally dozens of them. In our example, we're going to use account. So I simply choose account and click OK. Once I've done that, DataBridger reads the portion of the WSDL file that relates to the object named account, and it lists in my window all of the attributes, if you want to call them that, of the account object. And those attributes include columns, field names, fields that are on that entry, as well as other related objects. And you can see in this data type column that we have things like objects or strings or numbers. Well, all of these different pieces relate to attributes of the thing called account in Salesforce. And we need to choose those attributes that we want to work with. Now, a moment ago I shared the listing of the CSV file. It had an account number or entity ID. It had a name, it had a street address, a city, a state, and a postal code. So those are the things we want to make sure we're working with in this exercise. You'll see though that as I scroll through this list, every single column type attribute is already highlighted or selected. So we only need those handful selected. The easiest way to unselect these entries is to basically choose the entire column by shift clicking and then turning them off. Now that we have done that, we can go back and choose the individual columns attributes that we want to work with. The account number is one of those. The billing city, the billing postal code, the billing state, and the billing street are others. We're going to also choose the description column that allows us to populate a comment or some other kind of description information about the account in Salesforce. And finally, we're going to choose the name column. So each of these columns are things that we will populate when we create an account in Salesforce. That will be done through another exercise. At this point, we've completed the step of defining the request that we're going to send to the cloud, and that is the columns that we're going to populate when we do this data load. We then can click on the response, which is what does the cloud data source send back to us as a response to our request. And it sends us a result set, and that result set can be a list of error messages or success codes or some other kind of information about the request we made, which would be to create an account for each of the rows in our source table. So again, I have to expand this. Now this actually returns a potential set of records. So we have to say this is rows of data, and we expand it. And when we see that expanded list, we see that there are potential errors and that there is a response that can come back with an ID and a value, a Boolean value of success. So that would be either true or false. So when we issue a request to create an account in Salesforce through the resulting process that will be built in subsequent exercises, then that request is either going to succeed, in which case the response from Salesforce will be a value of true in the success part of the result response, and it will respond to us the ID that was assigned to that account in Salesforce. Every object in Salesforce has a unique identifier within that object structure, so every account that we create has a unique ID associated with it that's internal to Salesforce, but it is in fact the identifier for that object. Since Salesforce responds with that ID when we have successfully written or created a record in the account object, that's a piece of data that we could use subsequently in our process if we wished to, for instance, record that Salesforce ID somewhere in a separate database. Maybe we have a database that has customer or account data in it, and we want to record the Salesforce ID in that account. This is why Salesforce returns that to us, so that we could use that in a separate process or in a data structure elsewhere. So we have specified the information we want to send in requests to Salesforce. We have seen and expanded the information that Salesforce will respond to us on each of those requests. The last thing we want to do in this case is to actually provide a name to the virtual table in the virtual table name field. And you'll see that the default is just the action we had chosen, create. And just to make it clear for us, we're just going to name this something like create account. That's all we have to do on this particular kind of virtual table. And once we have saved this, save and close, then we can see that that is now listed underneath the Salesforce data source itself. So we will eventually have multiple virtual tables in our Salesforce data source. And if we click on this one called create account, you can see exactly what I had specified as the fields we're going to populate, the attributes about each account, and what their names are. This will be used in a subsequent exercise to actually put together the mappings and scripts that will perform that step. That ends this particular exercise. We'll have more exercises for additional kinds of virtual tables. Thanks for listening. Join us again on our next episode.